Welcome to Democracy Nerd. In these discussions, we've been lucky to have academics, political scientists, historians, each who nerd out with us about a theory or a moment in time or a threat to democracy. Sometimes it's useful to nerd out on the present moment. Sometimes, as the saying goes, we miss precedented times. There was a time, it seems not long ago, that events in Washington, D.C. could be pretty routine. That feels like a quaint bit of past now. For good or for ill, it does seem that historic moments are impacting Capitol Hill somewhat regularly, including just about right now. Joining us to help with sort of a deep dive into recent events shaking up Congress is David Smith, the Washington, D.C. bureau chief of The Guardian. Thank you so much, David, for joining us. Welcome to Democracy Nerd.
Thanks for having me.
It can be a challenge to prepare for a show with someone who is in the thick of things on Capitol Hill as things are changing very quickly. The topics of interest yesterday quickly become something of feels like the distant past, yesterday's news. Before we begin with the issues we want to discuss with you earlier, we want to take a moment to at least ask about what's top of mind for you. It might, for instance, be the somewhat historic removal of the Speaker of the House.
Yes, I think that is top of mind this week. But as you say, we know from experience, come next week, there will probably be something else. And Kevin McCarthy will be old news. There is such a rapid turnover, such a metabolism in Washington these days. Just writing about the McCarthy affair, just remembering that he stood up and announced an impeachment inquiry into Joe Biden. That already feels like ancient history. It was only a few weeks ago. This has been the way of things in the Donald Trump era, really, since I arrived here in late 2015. It feels like being churned inside a washing machine. It's just a constant turnover of stories and events. And when you add into that the coronavirus pandemic, time does warp, and something that happened yesterday can feel like ancient history, and vice versa. It's certainly rapid fire and hard to keep up.
No, the impeachment inquiry of the current president of the United States, the 91 indictments of the most recent and current candidate of the president of the United States, now a new speaker. I want to see if there are beats that are occurring to you that feel like, and I mean rhythms, that feel like the underlying bass notes to the cacophonous treble. I'm wondering if there are reflections that you're having, and even time warp is one of them. Things are now disrupted so frequently that even adjusting for time is one of the things that we should be aware of. Any lessons that you're starting to draw, or reflections you're having, or ways that people who are trying to understand events in Washington should be keeping in mind that are underappreciated, undercovered, underdiscussed in the discourse?
Well, I think the two big themes of my time here, which fit well really with working for The Guardian, where we're trying to give wider context and explain events to a global audience. Those two themes are, firstly, a divided states of America, polarization. I mean, that has been a running theme of my time here. Republicans versus Democrats, the way they just agree on less than they used to, and you can see that in the votes in Congress. The era of you're either Trump or anti-Trump, and then the way it manifests even socially and culturally. We see those surveys where a Democrat would not want their child to marry a Republican and vice versa. We see the New York Times doing a comparison of here's a Republican's fridge versus here's a Democrat's fridge in terms of what they've got inside. Here's the TV shows that one set watch and then the other set watches. I think those divisions tend to run through everything and explain a lot. And then the second point, which is certainly related, is the decline of democracy and decline of trust in institutions. You see that again creeping up over years, if not decades, from the right-wing assault on the judiciary, figures like Leonard Leo, dark money, the appointment of Supreme Court justices, perhaps the ultimate manifestation, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which was actually, something undemocratic in the sense of it was against the will of the people. And you see other manifestations in terms of the way the Senate is not really representative of the American population. You see it in the Electoral College. Very disturbingly, we've seen obviously gerrymandering and general dysfunction, and I think that helps explain why Kevin McCarthy was ousted. And again, now the American people will see Congress in chaos, factional infighting, and really not much effort to fix people's day-to-day problems. They won't be talking about inequality or racism or even Ukraine. They will be trying to elect a new speaker in a bit of a food fight. And so that is just going to sow more distrust in these institutions. And sadly, we know from history, when that happens, that's fertile ground for a demagogue to come along.
I want to return to those big themes about division. I want to take issue with the word polarization and the impact on the decline of trust in democracy. And that's one of the areas we want to discuss. And then return to the present moment. From your, do you think Gates's successful effort to remove Kevin McCarthy, was that just about decided when McCarthy was having a hard time even becoming speaker, when the rules were set, when the rules then laid out that all it took was a single member to file a motion to remove the speaker? Do you think this almost became inevitable then, or were there moments in time? Is this foundation psychohistory where the events are going to happen, or is this something that where human decision still mattered?
I think in this case, it was a tragedy foretold. It was, the seeds of destruction were planted that day when McCarthy agreed to make those concessions, trying to cut a deal with the far right, including that rule change that had allowed one member to move to vacate the chair. I think many political analysts would say it was only going to be a matter of time then. And even though McCarthy tried to throw bones to the far right, such as launching an impeachment inquiry with no factual basis, and even during this government shutdown standoff, obviously Ukraine funding was removed. But I think the nature of Trump and MAGA extremism is that it's never enough. And so McCarthy was always living on borrowed time. And if it had not been this, it would have been the next one. He was always very vulnerable, and was no longer a useful tool for the far right. And I guess crucial moments. Obviously, there was the standoff over the debt limits, the debt ceiling, which could have forced an absolutely catastrophic default. That at least was avoided, but there were plenty of people on the far right who were angry about the deal that McCarthy cut, and so therefore, when it came to the government shutdown, they were ready to walk the extra mile. And it's I think again a measure of some of those themes, the normalization of what used to be very abnormal, that now you see both government shutdowns and impeachments wielded as a political cudgel. These were things that were once rare and shocking and unthinkable, and now they're strangely routine.
You mentioned the impeachment without a factual basis. You mentioned Leonard Leo. You also used the word polarization, and this is where I want to take a little bit of issue, or at least just lobby you. This is the term that is used, polarization. Challenge I have with the term is it suggests that there is a sphere and there are poles on each side, and it's a roughly symmetrical dynamic. From my vantage point, and I have my own biases to be clear, but from my vantage point, it is not a symmetrical dynamic. It is not as simple as good guys and bad guys, but it is, because saying good guys probably overstates it, but it is not the case that it seems to me that the current, I use your term, the current sort of MAGA Republican movement is its own creature that does not have a particular ballast. and that because of it, or related to it at least, it wins if there is a decline in trust in democracy. That there isn't, hey, we're using democracy, and therefore you have your views, I have my views, we're going to disagree on some things, you have some objectives, I have some objectives, let's see if our objectives can match up in some places so we can accomplish them, and then I'll give a little bit and you'll take a little bit, and then we'll get to a deal. But if the primary objective, if the only thing that one team is sure about, and that's not 51% of the people, or even 49% of the people, it's not 51% of Congress, it's not even 49% of Congress, but if one team of people, if one of the biggest teams of people, if the only objective that they like is the other team being hurt, the other team, that therefore the very act of compromise, the very act of you get a little bit of what you want, I get a little bit of what I want, even that becomes a sin. Not just the portion you've compromised, just the deal itself becomes a sin. Them not being done harm is a sin. I'm no longer prepared to call that polarization. It's something different. It feels like we need new rhetorical architecture from the brilliant minds of The Guardian, et cetera, including so that I can borrow it, steal it, and use it to be able to describe this dynamic, because I can't find a historical analog to it. We're still trying to figure out the words to describe it, and feel free to push back on me. But that's some of the sort of the base note that I'm trying to come to grips with beneath the cacophonous trouble.
Yeah, and I think I agree, really. And a couple of words that maybe are more useful than polarization to throw at you, certainly one we like at The Guardian, is the concept of minority rule.
Yeah.
There's a constituency here that, as you're touching on there, I think is by no measure a majority of the American population. And poll after poll shows actually that a lot of liberal ideas and policies are very popular with a lot of people. And I'm not just talking about abortion rights, but all sorts of other things. And yet Republicans and the far right wield tremendous influence in courts and Congress and other places. I think minority rule is one expression of this democratic dysfunction, and probably the overturning of Roe versus Wade was the ultimate sort of concrete manifestation of that so far. But there are others, and I'm sure there'll be more to come. Another word that is useful in this kind of era probably is nihilism. That I think the Democratic Party and some Republicans are still pursuing an old model along the lines you're talking about of, we're here to legislate, cooperate on some things, disagree on others. But there is now a wing of the Republican Party, Matt Gaetz and others, who are nihilistic, who are burn it all down, who
nihilistic, not NEO, but nihilistic or nihilistic NIH. Good pronunciation question. But just to be clear, just so I'm spelling the word you're saying correctly, you mean like NIH. You mean somebody with a death, somebody with not the National Institutes of Health, but somebody with a death wish, an institutional death wish.
And another word that's been used about Gaetz is political arsonist. It's just this idea of sort of burn it all down. And some of that, I guess, there might be an ideology in itself. And again, sort of maybe Steve Bannon, maybe people on the far left and the far right, have those notions that you have to destroy in order to create, and that, the system is so rotten, the only way to do it is this kind of purge. But I suspect others there are actually just making a more cynical calculation that, if you make something dysfunctional and broken and totally distrusted, then there may be political benefits in it for some. And I suppose I'm thinking of Trump as the obvious example of that. Put it this way, right now, this fight over the speakership, on the surface at least, it looks politically advantageous to Democrats. They can go out and say, we are now the party of order and discipline. We are getting things done, such as creating jobs and reducing the cost of prescription drugs and so on. And look at those guys across the aisle. They are at each other's throats, totally dysfunctional and chaotic. And that might work, but on a deeper level, I fear the other possibility is that a lot of voters say, a plague on all their houses and Washington is broken and Congress doesn't work. We need an outsider to come and clean it all up and to fix this. And Trump has at least tried to play that role first time, second time, and now third time. You know, he's actually relatively clever at still portraying himself as sometimes running against the Republican Party, certainly running against the Republican elites. And, you know, and when it suits him, he'll be happy to denounce members of Congress. We certainly see that with Mitch McConnell in the Senate. And, you know, if he goes to a rally and says, you know, the Republican House is in disarray, I'm the one who can sort it out, then that might resonate. So sadly, we've reached a state of affairs where a broken democracy and a dysfunctional system might actually work to the political advantage of these MAGA extremists.
No, you put your thumb on it. To me, that anybody who loves democracy should not be, in my view, maybe it's short-term view, but nonetheless, should not be rooting for the dysfunction of democracy, right? Like it's you want that project to be successful, to have wins and losses, but over time to be successful. And I have to say I'm proud, and maybe and I don't know, maybe the filter bubbles filter to me things they know will only enrage me in the ways they want to enrage me. But I saw many fewer stories that had headlines like Congress in disarray, and more that again use sort of polarization, sort of oh, Congress can't get it done, government doesn't work, democracy doesn't work sort of frame. Again, because I think if one's setting aside polarization for a moment, if we use the sort of Congress in disarray frame, then from that, oh, I guess, well, then maybe Congress doesn't really work. And then, oh, yes, as you said, a pox in other houses. And then you say, well, what's the alternative, right? Well, maybe it's not democracy. Maybe it's a red Caesar, right? Maybe it's something entirely different from democracy at all. And I've been either I'm not seeing it. I know I'm seeing everything. I don't look at Drudge Report every day. I mean, you know, I'm not seeing everything, but I saw much less of the Congress in disarray, these people can't get their house in order, and much more of something that's a little bit more like saying political arsonist, Matt Gaetz, you know, Republicans, MAGA Republicans, et cetera, and trying more accurately sort of tell the story what's actually going on, which I know maybe I should put in the form of a question. How do you navigate that stuff? Because since the days of Edward R. Murrow, since the days when there were two political parties that were both clearly engaged in a project of democracy. They had important disagreements, but it seemed like a majority of both parties were engaged in the project of democracy. That the member of the press as referee, the member of the press as finding the truth by finding the middle between the two opposing crews seemed like ethical journalism. Anything that felt too one-sided was not ethical journalism. What does one do if truth itself starts being a little one-sided? If truth itself starts calling out the real threats to democracy, if journalism says, well, we can argue about marginal taxation, we can argue about a woman's right to choose, but we at least have to have a shared fundament in democracy. If there's a team that's not for democracy, how does journalism handle that? How do the editorial meetings discuss it? How do journalists get trained on it? What do we do?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's become one of the central questions of this era, I think, journalistically. And you've seen the likes of the New York Times tiptoeing towards, okay, we're going to use the word lie for the first time about Donald Trump, and we're going to use the word racist. And, you know, we're going to be fact-based, and sometimes, you know, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other is not the right approach. And, you know, the famed examples of this now are obviously, you know, are we going to give half our time to a climate scientist and then the other half to a climate change denier,
right?
Or a person who says the Earth is flat and a person who says it's round. You know,
yep.
So there are some guidelines there, and yeah, I think over the last 7 or 8 years, the media has certainly been on that journey. And in some cases now they get it right, and in some cases they still get it wrong. And some of the techniques that we talk about, others talk about, are, you know, just give one example, the so-called truth sandwich, where, okay, if you're going to quote Donald Trump, then introduce your paragraph by stating what the facts are on immigration, climate, you name it. Then have the quote from Trump saying what he's saying, but then have a follow-up paragraph explaining no, windmills do not kill birds, or no, you know, electric boats do not electrocute you, or whatever it is, whatever bizarre thing he said recently. And I think certainly journalists are still aware of, hang on a minute, am I in danger here of acting as a spokesperson for the Democratic Party? But frankly, when an impeachment inquiry is launched without a basis, and even the Republicans' own star witnesses say Joe Biden should not be impeached, then yes, you are going to say some similar things to what the Democrats are saying, and you're going to quote them. And I think you're right. There's a fundamental point here that things are lopsided. Just to go back to what you're saying about polarization, it's not a 50-50 scenario here. And another great example of that is, people like to say, well, there's MSNBC on one hand and Fox News on the other hand. And on one level, that's kind of true. They're two sides of the same coin, but on another level, that's completely not right, in that, like any organization, I'm sure MSNBC occasionally screw up and get things wrong, but I think most of us would agree MSNBC is a decent, respectable journalistic organization trying to get facts right, and if they make a mistake, they correct them. Whereas Fox News is frequently just pushing pro-Trump, pro-Republican propaganda, and we saw in the Dominion lawsuits where that ended up, and the court was a powerful fact checker there. And I think that dichotomy is a good metaphor for more generally how this is not a 50-50 split nationally. And what could journalists do in the middle of that? We can just stick to the facts, and I think we can say unabashedly, unapologetically, yes, we are biased in favor of truth. We're biased in favor of science. We're biased in favor of human rights. We're biased in favor of democracy. I don't mind having those biases. And yeah, so we'll continue to navigate all these issues.
No, helpful. I appreciate the thought process. I appreciate the candor, and I appreciate the admission that it's hard. Right. I am here not to throw stones, but to wave my hands in the air and ask, what the heck do we do? And I also appreciate what you had to say about MSNBC, and even setting that aside for a moment. I remember something that George Will had to say about NPR. And this is before MSNBC. And he said, well, there isn't liberal news media. Well, there's NPR. And his case for that was that NPR has a liberal audience. It has a more urban audience, and an audience is more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. But that is very different than describing their project, right? The NPR project is not to elect a certain set of people or to build a certain power base, right? The Fox News project from jump was in fact to do that, and being able to parse that a little bit. And by the way, MSNBC is still subject to capital markets, right? MSNBC is not making editorial cases that in favor of antitrust law, in favor of limiting their own economic power. I mean, they are, if they're two sides to a political coin, right? There's one side that's not fully represented, and so I appreciate you talking about that. I'm bouncing back and forth, maybe on purpose. Back to where we are now. What happens now? And I know this has become a parlor game, but I'm interested in your perspective, because you're talking to lots of people, listening to lots of people, about who becomes the next speaker. If this is, because it's dangerous, right? We've sort of thought about it. Everybody's thought about it. It's even why, and I was talking to a friend of mine who was a pretty highly ranked political operative, and he said, well, what I'm glad about is that it's like, it would have been nice if they came up with a deal, but there had to be a deal. I'm very glad the Democrats didn't just say, okay, fine, we'll vote for a Republican speaker, because at the point of threat of there being a worse Republican speaker. At the same time, it doesn't seem very likely there will be a Republican speaker that is more likely to make sure that the government doesn't shut down, is more likely to make sure that there are deals just to make sure government works, to make sure that there is something done in Europe to limit the sort of Russian hegemony. Yeah, as you think about the moment now, or even looking a little bit forward, what happens now? Jim Jordan, Steve Scalise?
Yeah, hard to say. I see and hear a lot of evidence that it's not going to go smoothly, that again, we'll have this struggle between the so-called centrists and the far right, including over that rule of whether you only need one vote for a motion to vacate. There could be a bit of a replay of the Kevin McCarthy election in that sense, and that the priorities and the issues are the same. I guess Steve Scalise seems to be the favorites, and Matt Gaetz has said he could support that. Jim Jordan, I think, would certainly be more alarming to Democrats. He's such a Trumpian figure and pugilist, and we've seen that on the committees. And then maybe somebody else will come along, but I think on one level, how much does it matter? Because this is going to be bigger than one personality.
Yeah.
Whoever's in that chair, the structural issues will remain, both the short term and the long term. And in the short term, Kevin McCarthy was doomed from the beginning because Republicans' majority was so narrow in the House. Of course, it's worth remembering Nancy Pelosi had the same narrow majority and managed to unify Democrats much more comfortably. And so much for that notion that Democrats in disarray and Republicans being the disciplined ones. This has been the other way around. But McCarthy dealing with that MAGA faction with such a narrow majority was always going to be difficult. And the next speaker will face the same challenge. So there's obviously still great danger of a government shutdown next month, and then potentially another year or so of paralysis. And thank goodness elections come around relatively quickly, and so the people will get a chance to change the makeup of the House, and then who knows? A much bigger Republican majority would probably be able to get things done more easily, or a Democratic majority certainly would.
So first of all, thank you very much. And even going back to the thing you said at the beginning of that, we talk about people because it's harder to talk about systems, right? So I said, what about Jim Jordan? What about Steve Scalise? And you said, yeah, either one. Still, what do we do, right? Still, they'll be subject to the same limitations that have been going on. If it is bad enough that Newt Gingrich is riding against the extreme wing of the Republican Party, then it gives us some sense of where we are. And so that's my little plug, my applaud, and my applause, as well as my plead to figure out how we better talk about systems, how we better talk about sort of the complex context and not merely the personality. My favorite, if you haven't already read it, I'll give you a book plug. It's Network Propaganda by Yochai Benkler and a couple other people at Harvard and MIT, and that helped me understand the sort of the political dynamic we are, where I'm not prepared to call Matt Gaetz a victim. I'm not prepared to call I'm not prepared to call Kevin McCarthy a victim. And at the same time, and I'm certainly not ready to call Fox News a victim. And I know that if any of them departs from the sort of network of propaganda that's been built, they don't have power anymore, right? They are any more that a marauding army will still be led by the same general. If that general says, "Oh, I'd like to compromise. I'd like to," and bloodthirsty soldiers say, "No, we're gonna go with the colonel who still wants to fight." So I appreciate you. I appreciate you doing that. In terms of the very present moment, tell us what you can about Patrick McHenry, the House Speaker pro tempore, who is currently acting House Speaker. What can he do? Can legislation be brought to the floor? What about appropriations bills? Does it have any power over the federal budget? Does it have any impact on the impeachment inquiry? Or is it just means literally that, I don't know, somebody gavels in when lunchtime is?
My understanding, and I certainly don't claim to be a congressional rules expert here, but my belief is Patrick McHenry has almost no powers to do anything, and certainly not to bring legislation to the floor or get things done. I think he's just got Congress in a holding pattern, and that's why they're not even in the chamber at the moment, and they will reconvene. Last I saw, he's like sort of holding a candidate forum on Tuesday, and then the speakership election will be on Wednesday. And there is an element of there, of course, in that almost nobody knows in a sense that where this is unprecedented. McCarthy was the first speaker ever to be ousted. So, another of those phrases you hear a lot these days, uncharted territory. But yeah, basically, we have to wait for an actual proper speaker to get things done. And just what you said before that, reminded me. Just last night, I was reading about the host of a Trump podcast who said the guests she has on, there's always a split between the aberrationists and the continuity people. And by that she meant there's one school of thought that personalities do matter tremendously and that Trump is an aberration and that he, as an actor here, upended American democracy, changed the Republican Party, changed everything. And then there's the continuists who think he should be seen in context. The Republican Party was evolving this way for decades. He's more of a symptom than a cause. And I think in history those debates are always very interesting. And you can talk about Adolf Hitler, many others.
Right. No, I've been thinking about this a lot.
I think in the Trump case, I would lean more towards the latter school of thought, having written more than once about everything from Newt Gingrich's bare knuckle style of politics to the rise of Fox News, to certainly the Tea Party, the racist revolt against Barack Obama, just the tectonic plates shifting under American society. I think, when Obama was elected, white Christians were still in the majority, and by the time he left, they were in the minority. If Trump didn't exist, I suspect somebody else would have come along, maybe years earlier, maybe years later, maybe not quite so wild, maybe even more wild. But ultimately, I think you can see a through line to him.
No, I appreciate you going that deep and broad. It's been on my mind a lot, and I've mentioned it briefly, but I didn't explain it. So to people who watch the TV show Foundation, who read the novels, you know what I'm talking about. But there's currently on Apple we get no plug here, we get no benefit for saying this, to be clear. But the show called Foundation, and without giving too many spoilers, the sort of essence of the story is that someone has invented a device that doesn't predict particular historical dates and facts and people, but it predicts historical trends and says they're inevitable. It makes sort of the case that individual personalities don't matter very much. And I've been thinking about it a lot. You mentioned Hitler on a trip to Europe. I was thinking about it. I said, yes, weaponizing anti-Semitism to wield power in Europe was not invented by Hitler. That it being, one could make an argument, and I tend to be both and nature and nurture, right? That Donald Trump is special and weird, and he's not the only thing that could have been special and weird to tap into the historical inevitability or historical sort of incentives, and that it may have been inevitable that someone was going to wield the power of anti-Semitism in Europe at the time in the machine age, right, and in the media age, at a time that it was going to reach a climax, and the world was going to have to say, no, we can't do this. It's with the pre-nuclear but post airplane era, like the world has to come together and knock down the last tyrant who does that. And I feel that's that part of the inevitability of Trump. I agree. Like, Donald Trump was not the leading theologian of this crew. He just listened to a lot of radio and watched a lot of TV and learned the lines of what Republican voters wanted to say. And I wanted to shout to the people who were saying, I don't remember the story or the analysis, the book that was, does the party still decide, right? Like, there was the theory of the party decides, and that meant sort of the party gatekeepers decided. And so maybe the party doesn't decide. And what I wanted to shout was, yes, it does. You're just misunderstanding who the party is. The party is now the Yochai Benkler network propaganda. It is now all of those people on social media, all of those people who are listeners who will pick the thing that they watch and listen to and donate to based on if it reinforces their priors. And their priors are bloodthirsty. Their priors are to destroy their political enemy. Their priors are not to accomplish necessarily a shared policy objective or to bend the arc of history towards a particular piece of justice. And so I appreciate that. The thing I used to say, and I don't say it anymore because I think Trump is so important, but I say he is not the head of the snake, he is the rattler, right? He did not start the fire. Now he is, he has overtaken so much of the snake that I don't say that as much. But anyway, you might want to say something, so I'm talking for a minute. But
even now, there are debates over, has he lost control of the MAGA movement? I remember writing that story when, for example, he sat on stage and said that he'd received the COVID-19 vaccine, and he got booed for that. There is that sense, and certainly some of the candidates like Vivek Ramaswamy are making the case that MAGA is bigger than one man and could survive him, and certainly if Donald Trump dropped dead tomorrow, a lot of those people would still be there, maybe looking for an alternative cult leader, if you like, an alternative messiah. In this instance, I think, like a lot of things in life, it's a two-way relationship. He spotted the forces that were there, but he's also been smart in shaping them to his own ends. And it's interesting. Sometimes he taps into sentiment that he observes there. Sometimes the crowd are leading him.
It's if there is a mob, right? If the mob leader starts moving in a different direction, he may get trampled or just left behind. If the cult is strong enough, the cult will remove the cult leader. If the cult leader says, no, we've been wrong about a few things. If you have a tiger by the tail, it doesn't mean you get to pull where the tiger goes. The tiger can pull you or just eat you. And I do think that dynamic, to not try to simplify that dynamic, but to clarify that dynamic, to me is the thing I appreciate most in modern journalism, is people that don't pretend we're in a moment of before, but still help us understand and make accessible what's happening now. And so I do think, and maybe I belabored it, but I do think that project is a worthwhile project, because ultimately anti-democracy, I avoid saying anti-democratic because I'm not trying to say this, for my own political biases aside, I'm not trying to say this in a partisan manner, at least not a partisan self-serving manner, that ultimately the only thing for anti-democratic forces, anti-democracy forces that will change them is for them to lose. Right? Like they have to lose, and they have to lose big, and it has to, and somebody who is looking to tap into that tiger, who's somebody looking to tap into that mob, who's somebody to lead that cult, that says, oh, if I do it, I don't get to be in charge anymore. And therefore, it seems to me the only solution, which gets us back to a little bit previously. We should talk about the Senate because it also exists. The House may have had the largest reverberations this past week, but there also have been shakeups impacting the U.S. Senate. Dianne Feinstein, the longtime lawmaker from California, the state's longest serving woman senator ever, I think, recently passed away at the age of 90 years old. She'd obviously been in declining health. I now wonder, she was suffered from a case of shingles requiring to rest at home. There have been concerns raised about her health. As I understood it, if she had voluntarily stepped down from office, she would have vacated her position on the Senate Judiciary Committee. There would have been no requirement on Senate leadership to name on Senate minority leadership to name a replacement or to allow for there to be a replacement. You can clarify if I'm wrong about that. But what happens now? Help us understand that dynamic or what happens now.
Well, of course, we already have a replacement for Dianne Feinstein, and yes, this brought to an end an unhappy year or two where some Democrats and others said she was holding on too long, that she was another example of America's gerontocracy, along with Joe Biden and Chuck Grassley and many others, that the Washington ruling class is very old and should step aside. And Feinstein had said she was going to retire at the end of her term, and then sadly she died last week, and it's another example of this strange time warp effect where, you know, she died last Friday and it already feels like a year ago or a lifetime ago. And the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, was quick to appoint her successor. One of the things about being a text-based newspaper journalist is I'm sometimes not very good at pronunciations, and so I'll let you fill in the name of that senator at some point. The new senator.
I'm hoping it's Laphonza Butler, but but my interactions with her have also been reading them. So if I get it wrong, I offer it with humility and apology. But it was the head of Emily's List, and
thank you.
And as I understand it, a key part of, and this is not, I mean, he was criticized for it as well as praised for it, but this is not an odd thing. This has happened in legislative appointments in my own home state, where somebody says, yes, we'll put somebody in, but we'd like somebody who's not getting a leg up on the election so that there's still an election that goes forward and nobody gets to be the incumbent. And that allowed Gavin Newsom to do two things. One, keep his pledge of appointing a Black woman to the U.S. Senate and not have to say to relatively prominent Democrats who were not Black women who were running for the U.S. Senate, I'm going to give somebody a leg up who's going to run against you.
That's right. And she's also the first Black, openly gay senator. And the only minor controversy seems to be that she spends more time in Maryland than California, but that seems to have blown over with all the other business going on Capitol Hill this week. And yes, you're right. Barbara Lee sort of wanted that job, but she's also running for the vacancy. So that would have been divisive probably to give it to her at the expense of Adam Schiff and Katie Porter. And so yeah, Democrats are back to full strength, which is probably just as well, given everything that's going on in Congress. And yeah, funny that Gavin Newsom would be playing this role. I mean, I just went to the Republican debate in Simi Valley, California last week. Gavin Newsom turned up in the spin room beforehand and afterwards, basically as Joe Biden's surrogate, and he was trying to strongly make the case that the winner of the Republican debate was Joe Biden and his agenda, because Republicans are in disarray and obviously all miles behind Trump, and just showing up in poor contrast to what Joe Biden is actually getting done at the White House. But Newsom certainly looked to me like a man, trying very hard to pretend he's not running for president. I'm
glad you brought it up. Because what occurred to me is that, and here I am, because I have both a right and a left hand, thinking in a right and a left hemisphere of my brain, putting the world into equivalencies that are false. But I will do it for a moment. That I thought of Gavin Newsom's game as seeming a little bit similar to the Republican debate, and I'll explain. Where there's this Republican debate happening with candidates having very little hope that they're actually going to beat Donald Trump, but with meaningful hope that he will not survive the primary. that somebody, they better not drop out, because he might be actually literally in jail. Maybe dynamic really will change. And then somebody, whoever's got the highest poll numbers, then might be the leading momentum gainer. I think everybody understands that dynamic. And not to be too cynical, but I think Gavin Newsom is doing the smart thing by not announcing a president, not criticizing Joe Biden, saying it's a win for the Biden agenda, being the pro-Biden person, not saying Biden shouldn't run, but being there just in case something happens. And it was too clear to me, the parallels between those very different dynamics.
Yes. I mean, look, Donald Trump was the oldest president in American history, and then Joe Biden surpassed that, and he became the oldest president in history. And now they're about to go head to head. And so, yeah, we've never been in a situation before. Anything can happen. And I think on the Democratic side, that certainly means there'll be more attention on Kamala Harris than there would normally be on a vice president, because, the running mate of an 80-year-old, there's a greater likelihood that you might have to step up and do the big job. And so you certainly see Nikki Haley, for example, constantly saying at rallies, I'm the one to take on President Harris. This election is going to be about President Harris, and so on. And obviously, Republicans like that because they see Harris's low approval rating, and I'm sure they could based on past form, rustle up some sexism and racism to help their cause, if that was the case. And yes, Gavin Newsom, he is not being especially subtle about this sometimes. I mean, he has this televised debate coming up against Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida.
The second choice versus the second choice.
Exactly.
And each of them wanting to be viewed as the second choice, not necessarily being the second choice.
That's right. Which, is dropping a big hint, and maybe it's a preview of the 2028 election. Maybe it's the alternative debate if Biden and or Trump both somehow fail to run for whatever reason. It's all very strange. And yeah, if you're a Republican, you probably want to keep going because Donald Trump is so unpredictable and surprised us so many times that, the last surprise of all would be him saying, I'm not running for some reason. Extremely unlikely based on all we know about him. But certainly, his health, all the court cases, I think, you cling to some distant hope that maybe, just maybe, he won't be the nominee, and then you want to be there to pick up the pieces. I mean, all of that said, for a long time, I have thought a Biden versus Trump rematch is still the most likely scenario.
And I want to offer this from the other side of my brain, a less cynical interpretation, which is not mutually exclusive, but less cynical interpretation of the Gavin Newsom thing. And that is that he's filling a void, and I'll explain. So when Bill Clinton was the Democratic president of the United States, he was the best enunciator of the values of his party, right? That was, in fact, why he got elected. When Barack Obama was president of the United States, he was the leading enunciator, the leading sort of band leader of the Democratic Party team. In fact, that was why he got elected. Joe Biden actually is an underrated communicator. As a younger man, I viewed him as one of the best communicators in American politics. And he is an older man now. And there is more of, vacuum may be too strong a word, but there is a space for the person who will come out and be the lead enunciator, the lead communicator of democratic, large, capitalized D democratic values. And I think he is filling that. And it doesn't merely need to be viewed as lying in wait for a tragedy, but in fact doing something that somebody's going to do, or at least somebody ought to do. I would offer that. I do want to ask something about Biden. So,
hey, can I just respond to your point?
Please.
I was just to say, and I think the obvious other person filling that role is Pete Buttigieg, Transportation Secretary, who, like Newsom, is fine going on Fox News and trying to reach the other side, so to speak. And I've interviewed Buttigieg a couple of times, as we all know, sort of tremendously eloquent and good at sort of coming up with pithy phrases, and sometimes quite good at put downs at the Republicans' expense. And certainly watching Newsom in action last week, I was struck that he not only has the charisma of a would-be president or leader, but Newsom's a good fighter. He's good at sardonic one-liners, and Democrats often get criticized for bringing a PowerPoint presentation to a knife fight and tiptoeing around and being too meek and not putting the boot in as ruthlessly as Republicans. But Newsom is good at that and fighting fire with fire. So yeah, in terms of what you're saying about this constellation of communicators, he's very good in that role. I think Joe Biden's strength is in some ways the fact that he's not sort of super charismatic and smooth and slick like Newsom. His great asset has always been he comes over as kind of ordinary Joe, the blue collar guy who's like you and me. It was very easy to accuse Hillary Clinton of being part of the elites. It's not so easy to accuse Joe Biden of being part of the elites. And as we all know from the last couple of elections, that point really matters with the white working class, Midwest, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin.
Exactly. The suburbs of Detroit, they care about that sort of thing. So let's stick with Biden for a moment. I've started doing a thing on my porch where I have somebody over because I asked the question of myself and the answer surprised me. So the question I will ask, and to be clear, these have been conversations with Democrats in Portland, Oregon, with people who vote in Portland, Oregon, and Donald Trump got 17% of the vote in my city. So you can predict there's not been a litmus test, and I don't even ask people's political party, but I can guess probably who they voted. And so I asked them their question: rank the presidents of the United States in your lifetime from worst to least worst. And I just listen, and I just listen. And an interesting thing happens towards the end, which is a lot of people are left with Biden as the last name they haven't said. Like they go through the people, Trump, way low, Bush way low, Nixon doesn't get that good of marks, right? Carter ends up being kind of in the middle. Then people have pretty widely differing views on Bill Clinton, right? Obama sort of middling, and a lot of people are left with, wait a minute, and literally it's a little bit of a surprise. They say, oh, and I said, so are you saying that Joe Biden is the best president of your lifetime, and you've been alive more than 40 years? And they're like, and they don't really want to say yes, but they're kind of left with, maybe he is. Now, let's not try to stipulate that, right? But let's imagine, or let us try to stipulate it just for argument's sake. If it's at least arguable, that among, and I think if you were going to ask Republicans, right, who is best or worst, I'd actually be interested in that question. But if it's at least arguable that among Democrats, Joe Biden is the best or among the best president of the United States of the last 50 years, why is it? And not just why his poll numbers are low. Because I understand that there's a strong base of Republicans that will be strongly, that now Bill Clinton's poll numbers wouldn't be the same as they were under the current political dynamic. I understand that part. The media landscape is very different now. But even sort of the press coverage of Joe Biden, the energy around Joe Biden, the discussion around him, that even the fact that when I ask people this question, they're surprised, or it hadn't even occurred to them that he actually might be a pretty darn effective president. They think old. They think, well, he wasn't Elizabeth Warren, or maybe he was a compromise candidate or whatever. Maybe he was a white guy. But then, oh wait, you have anything to say on the matter? Is it or an explanation for why? I guess I'll put it this way: does Joe Biden get the credit he deserves? And second, if not, why not?
Yeah, I like your survey idea. Kind of people would never volunteer. Oh yeah, I love Joe Biden. He's my favorite. But as you say, when they're forced to confront it and they eliminate the rest, they're left with Biden. That's a good way of doing it. Yeah, I do not think he gets the credit he deserves. And as has been well documented, that credit includes at least 4 major pieces of legislation that he steered through a very divided Congress. And we often hear the comparisons with Lyndon Johnson's The Great Society, or even Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And he's had to square the circle of being Mr. Bipartisanship, which he always was in the Senate, while at the same time calling out MAGA extremism and Donald Trump's threat to democracy. And he's actually been pretty successful as far as that goes. And then you add in, coming out of the coronavirus pandemic, lowest unemployment for half a century, best post-pandemic recovery of any major industrial economy. There is a lot there that has proved doubters wrong. And I think why he doesn't get the credit he deserves is a question that is keeping people at the White House up at night and is debated endlessly in newsrooms such as ours, and is one of the great mysteries in Washington, perhaps on the economy in particular. Certainly, I think part of it is, as you say, we're more divided than ever. You can imagine an era when, maybe Democrats would grudgingly say, oh yeah, Reagan's doing a good job on the economy, or Republicans would say, yeah, I quite like Bill Clinton secretly, or actually. Now we're in such silos, such echo chambers. So much of a sport is about your social identity. You have to be for one team and against the other team that already 40% or more of the country is going to write off Biden anyway. But added to that, I think some of these issues have potency. I mean, I went to a Donald Trump rally in Iowa a couple of weeks ago, and by far the two biggest issues among those Trump supporters were the US-Mexico border, which I notice is covered endlessly on Fox News, and Trump spent the first half hour of his rally talking about that. So, there's a not insignificant number of people who say the border is out of control, and they naturally blame the president for that, even though the White House would say, look, we put forward immigration reform legislation on day one and Congress has refused to play ball. But I think there may be some merit in the argument that Biden and Democrats have not given sufficient emphasis to the border issue, or not kind of looked at it full on. And just this week, somebody said to me, Biden should certainly have gone there earlier to try and preempt some of this. It would appear the border is a problem, and therefore it becomes a problem for Biden. And then the other big issue, which certainly relates to the economy, was inflation, especially gas prices. And I'm afraid, at least with the Trump hardcore, it's now too late to persuade them with a bunch of graphs and bar charts and statistics that actually things are getting better and inflation's coming down. When I talk to Republicans in general and Trump supporters in particular, I'm afraid that the perception is baked in now that inflation is out of control and it's Biden's fault for pouring in too many billions of dollars of government money. And obviously the worry for Biden is, has that perception spread and trickled into other sections of the population who therefore will either vote Republican or stay home in protest. And I sort of get why that is an issue, because even if, as some statistics suggest, wages have risen accordingly or perhaps even ahead of inflation, everybody can relate to that visceral feeling of going into a grocery store and, oh my God, look at the price of eggs these days, or do you know how much I paid for dinner last night? Obviously, when it's David Brooks of the New York Times tweeting about his airport dinner, including alcohol, it's not so resonant. But everybody else in the real world can sort of feel the pain of those prices, and you're not necessarily thinking to yourself, yeah, but it's okay because my wages went up last month, so I can cover this. It's still a shock. And again, we all know the external forces relating to oil prices and Ukraine and so on, but the president tends to get the blame for this. So I think those are some of the things denying him the credit. Not to mention just the fact that your average person in the street. I mean, I think surveys have shown this. They don't know what the Inflation Reduction Act is, and they maybe vaguely have heard of the infrastructure bill, but it'll take a while to actually manifest in their daily lives. So legislation on Capitol Hill feels quite abstract compared to that shock of wow, look at the price of filling my gas tank these days.
Yeah, I have a few additional thoughts. First, I'll amplify those. Yeah, on the wages increase versus the price increase. Yeah, if I get a raise, it's because I worked hard. It's because I'm smart. It's because I'm so great. That's why I got a raise. But if the price of gas went up, well, that's because something I don't like did it. It's not because something I did like did it. It's something I don't like did it. And therefore, easy. And then the chatter is a lagging indicator, right? Like it's sort of truth gets in or lack of truth gets in, and then it's spread, and it takes a while for the next truth to get its boots on. And it's a very useful talking point. And of course, it's also a talking point that's liked by kind of the economic strategist, the center of the right, that they want to deliver that argument out there because they want to be able to have that, want to be able to say, oh, look, remember when we did the government spending before? That's why we shouldn't do it again, because it did inflation, right? They're lobbying for history and for future power discussions as much as anything else. There are a couple other, so yes to those things, and a couple other things that I've wondered about. So one is, it just feels like, and this is the reaction I've got from my little parlor game, but or it's informed by that it just doesn't seem that cool to say I'm a Joe Biden Democrat. It's just not that cool. And I wonder kind of, and that's including all the things you said, right? I think it's also a little bit because Joe Biden said something where I thought he was wrong, and I think he was right, right? And where he was saying, he was talking about bipartisanship when he was running for president, and very smart people, including people who we talked to on this program, including me, like being hopeful but also skeptical, said, yeah, the political world is different, Joe. It's different than it was when you entered the Senate as a young man. There are no longer like conservative Democrats in the South representing Southern districts as there were when you started. There are no longer liberal Republicans representing the North in Congress when you started. We now have a more divided, a more willing to engage a minority rule political team. You had a Senate leader who said his most important objective was not to pass a particular set of bills, but to topple the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, right? That's a different political landscape. And so, this kumbaya, let's get along, is foolishness. And yet he was right. And yet there still were, because even U.S. senators have to be elected statewide. Even they want to be able to say to their, and not just if you're in West Virginia, even they want to be able to say, this is a bipartisan solution, or this is reasonable. Joe Biden not just having the knives out, having a different style, saying, hey, let's work together, did actually matter. I realized when I served a couple terms in a legislative body that the job of being a campaigner and an activist was very much about elevating the energy in the room so that people would act. That the work of lawmaking very often is to lower the energy in the room. The easiest bill to pass is one that's called technical fix. Oh, it's a technical fix, right? Technical fix. We're going to reinstitute antitrust enforcement in the United States. It's just a technical fix. Everything's a technical fix. It can have big ramifications. And that Joe Biden's style has been to lower the energy in the room. That has been effective and useful. And maybe Gavin Newsom helps. Maybe Pete Buttigieg helps. Maybe the MSNBC doesn't help all that much. Maybe there are other folks who can then have to be the trumpeter to say, hey, see that more quiet style? It's actually useful. Somebody else has to thump the drum, because he's not spending all the time thumping the drum unless he's talking about democracy and the fundamental threats to democracy, where he's willing to thump the drum. And so all the people who are like, no, the definition of inspiration in the Democratic Party should be Bernie Sanders. The more you depart from that, the less inspiring you are, or well, he's not like that. So it's not cool for us to say among our liberal friends that we think he's a good president. So that's the other piece of the dynamic, to take nothing away from gas prices, but that's the other piece of the dynamic that I've been curious about. Yeah,
that's a good point. I mean, do you remember in 2020, Senator Michael Bennett's pitch for why he should be president was, I will be boring. You will go 2 or 3 weeks without even thinking about me or hearing of me, which was taking it even further than you're saying, and was a sort of understandable response to the Trump years. Because Trump was chaos and celebrity and in our faces all the time and tweeting at weekends, and it was bedlam, and Biden, therefore, I think was an antidote to that in many ways. And certainly, I can tell you, weekends in Washington feel a bit quieter, and not just because of the lack of tweets. He did take the temperature down, which is exactly what was needed. Counterintuitively, I've certainly seen the argument that during the last 2 or 3 years, Congress actually was fairly productive. It actually got a fair amount done, and most of it, again, sort of slightly echoing what you're talking about, legislation that doesn't get written about in news headlines and most people don't notice, but it was just kind of quietly done by Democrats and Republicans, and then slightly more famously, bipartisan gun legislation and some other things. As I said, it's this paradox where the Republican Party, in some ways, is more extreme than ever, and Biden has to denounce the MAGA attacks on democracy, while with his other hand picking up the phone to Mitch McConnell and saying, can we get this done and can we push this through? And certainly, I think you see some distinction between the House and the Senate. The House feels more chaotic these days and more of a hotbed of MAGA extremism. And I went to Marjorie Taylor Greene's home district, for example, where they all love her, and I think it's a function, obviously, of the primary system where the loudest voices are rewarded, and there are lots of MAGA people in very safe seats. Whereas, as you say, in the Senate, you still have to appeal statewide, and therefore a little degree of moderation is required. And so, I would feel safer about funding Ukraine's war against Russia if it was solely in the hands of the Senate, whereas the House looking a bit shaky. That said, the Senate has its moments of madness. I mean, this is a chamber that contains, Ted Cruz of Texas, and I think J.D. Vance is an interesting character. The way he's trying to copy some of these Trump ideas of we should become the party of the working class, and it's only people who use their hands who really matter, and so on. And obviously Josh Hawley is there as well. So it's not a complete sort of paragon of sort of John McCain era Republicanism by any means.
No, it's a thread that, and I want to get to a couple of specific things before we wrap, and thank you for generosity of your time. But the economic tension within the political parties, that as the urban-rural split has become clear in American politics, or the big sort has become clear, and that economic realities, that cities tend to have more money, that the economic dynamics within political parties are more confused, right, than they might otherwise be. Who's to say than they ever were, but than they might otherwise be. And it has yet to, the thing that I am waiting for, and I've seen, like, I saw Tucker Carlson say a thing like he wouldn't want robotic trucks because they would get truckers out of jobs, and by the way, that would require regulation. So like tiny little slivers. But what I'll be waiting for is, well, okay, if you're for the working class, you're for the working class, right? Like, how do you feel about labor unions? How do you feel about wages? How do you feel about benefits? How do you feel about work days per week? How do you feel about antitrust legislation? How do you feel about progressive taxation, right? How do you feel about an estate tax, right? The various things that actually would create an economic system that was good for working class people. That would be, so it's not just an exercise in marketing. It's not just Ronald Reagan putting on a cowboy hat, but it in fact is a true transformation of a political party. That would be very interesting. And maybe the best chance for a pro-working class future of the country would have two parties that were in fact genuinely, not only through hoodwinking, but genuinely competing for working class votes. There is, although, I am not trying to get a symmetrical world. I don't think it exists, but that actually, I mean, Eisenhower said that it would be foolish for anybody not to be pro-labor union because they wouldn't win an election, right? If we got to a place where there was the working class people were advocated by two parties, there would be some benefits to that. I hope that if we got that and democracy, I'd be pretty pleased.
Well, of course, not so long ago, we had that split screen of both Joe Biden and Donald Trump going to see the auto workers in Michigan, and probably teased out some of the differences. Biden was visiting the union, and Trump was effectively visiting the workers rank and file. Although I think in practice, from what I gather, there were not necessarily even that many workers at his rally. It was kind of other Trump supporters who showed up, even though it was in Michigan. Biden, I think, does have some union credentials, loves to call himself a union guy, and Democrats are generally still on the side of labor, whereas the Republican attack on this point feels somewhat spurious in that I think Trump is often, tapping into the white grievance, the sentiments of dislocation. He's sort of summoning an enemy. He's basically saying to a lot of that constituency, you are a victim of economic elites, and you're losing out to immigrants pouring over the border. And he's coming at it from an angle of trying to tap into anger and emotion there, which is a shame. While with his other hand, planning the next round of tax cuts that will benefit the rich and deepen inequality in society, and that is the great contradiction here for the Republican Party, that through all the Trump years, they had plenty of support from the rich still, and there's been some good books written about it by Evan Osnos and others about those wealthy people who would claim at least to despise Trump and all he stands for and despise his vulgarity, but reverting to old models, they say, oh yeah, the Democrats are going to tax us and Trump is going to cut our taxes. So, he'll be better for the economy. And I think someone from the Lincoln Project the other day, I thought gave a fairly good summary of who Trump's constituencies are. And, one of them is the wealthy people who want the tax cuts. Another are white people who are angry. And then the third constituency, obviously, is the religious right, who correctly saw that he would give them right-wing justices who might do things like overturn Roe versus Wade. And if you look at that kind of triangle that Trump put together, it's still operating in many ways, even though when you look at it too closely, some of those things might appear to contradict each other, but he walks that line.
So I know we've got to wrap. I did want to, here's a specific question. I forget how surprised I am that George Santos is still in Congress. And how is that possible? My other question is, Bob Menendez has now been, multiple Democrats have called for Bob Menendez's ouster. There are already candidates who have announced that that includes the other senator in his state, Cory Booker, which is a big thing, right? Because usually the other senator in your state, you've been to all kinds of events together, raised all kinds of money together, done all kinds of political business together. So that it's its own significant step. And at the same time, and Representative Andy Kim has announced he would primary him. In the early poll results released just recently, Kim beats Menendez 63-10 with a third of voters undecided. Not looking good for Menendez. Looks like he's out regardless. Tammy Murphy might announce a primary challenge. So if Menendez avoids prison time, it does look like his political career is finished regardless. At the same time, I haven't seen a bunch of Republicans trying to make big political hay about this. And that's surprising to me. All kinds of, look, you're saying we're corrupt. Look at that guy. How come that? How come Republicans haven't made hay about it, if I'm reading that correctly? And could it be the same answer? Could it be that the Republicans don't, either because they don't want to make, they don't want to say, oh, if somebody gets indicted, they should be ousted because that might say something about Santos or something about Trump or something about somebody else. How do you make sense of this?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can. I think that's a very good question, because you're absolutely right. When the Menendez scandal broke, you heard a whole bunch of Democrats saying who should resign, and not much noise from the Republican side, even though you'd have thought this is an absolute gift to a political party. I mean, this is an open goal. And yes, I can only speculate that it may be to do with Republicans no longer being the party of law and order. And if you think back to that, I think it was the first day of the impeachment hearing into Biden, when a Democrat said, if you think both Donald Trump and Hunter Biden should be convicted or should go to prison if they're found guilty, put up your hand. And none of the Republicans did, because they saw the trap that if they go after Hunter Biden, and I guess, yes, if they go after Bob Menendez, then they'll be obliged to go after Donald Trump as well. And, the entire narrative they're constructing now is that the FBI and Justice Department are bogus and corrupt and a tool of the Democrats and part of the deep state and so on. The only problem with that theory is that Republicans never usually have a problem being hypocritical. So, why not go after Menendez and then defend Trump? I mean, they usually find a way, and they're going after Hunter Biden. But still, I agree. It was curious. Maybe they're just so obsessed with Joe Biden's age and Hunter Biden that they didn't have enough ammunition left for Menendez. Who knows?
They'd already used up all their tweets or X's or whatever that. So then, last specific thing, I at least ought to ask something about the former president. Donald Trump is in court right now. And I don't know if the best question is, what do you think the most important thing for people to know? Or the best question is, any predictions about timing or how that interfaces with election timing? Not sure the best question. So the best question might just be anything you think people should be attending to, paying attention to, thinking about with respect to the former president and current candidate.
Well, certainly this trial in New York, I think you are seeing the merging of his election campaign with his legal troubles. Remember, he was not actually obliged to be in that courtroom, but he showed up knowing it would be on camera. And each day he's been standing in the court building, delivering his incendiary rhetoric, denouncing the judge, knowing he would get media coverage. You know, this is the star of The Apprentice. He understands the TV camera very well. Yeah, I think it's a preview of coming attractions in terms of the election campaign, and the legal battles are one and the same thing for Donald Trump. You know, again, you talk about Bob Menendez and others. I mean, those feel like sort of quaint scandals from another era, a time when politicians were ashamed and they had to hide from these things, and they really want you to forget them, you know, whereas Trump, of course, as ever reversed that, and he actually actively talks about his legal indictments when he's on the campaign trail and seeks to weaponize them to his advantage. And you know, I think we just have to step back for a moment and realize what an extraordinary and alarming moment this is in American politics, that next year you will have probably the Republican nominee for president shuttling between a courtroom one day and a campaign rally the next, and a courtroom another day. And the thing to watch, I think, certainly often in our coverage, is not necessarily so much Trump himself as, you know, what does that say about America? You know, who are his supporters? And certainly when I go to Trump campaign rallies, I listen to him and I quote a bit of what he says, but I'm usually more interested in who are the people there, why are they supporting him? And the one I went to a couple of weeks ago, you know, one Trump supporter said, I like him because he's very truthful and very honest. And another Trump supporter said, he's a great believer in the rule of law. Words spoken as he literally faces 91 criminal charges in 4 jurisdictions. So something is going on in terms of a, you know, through the looking glass alternative universe where up is down and left is right, and everything that the liberal world believes to be true is you know, the absolute opposite is the case in these people's minds. Yeah, I want to understand that mystery next year.
Understanding that looking glass as we come maybe almost full circle, understanding that looking glass, understanding that context, and not merely understanding and explaining the images that looking glass presents, to me is the challenge of modern journalism. I appreciate your work. I wanted to give one translation note. He said open goal. To be clear, that's an association football reference. We call it in the United States soccer, is a shortened for the association portion of association football. That is when the goalkeeper has left the box, making it easier to score what we would call a point, but they would never call a point. It is the world sport. You may already know it, but wanted to make sure, or at least poke a little bit of fun. Thank you so much, David Smith, DC Bureau Chief for The Guardian newspaper. So appreciate you being here.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for being a Democracy Nerd. Cheers.
Thank you.